Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to talk to everyone today in the morning and in the afternoon. The morning presentation, basically, I wanted to, talk about clinical trials at large. I think, scleroderma is a disease that, we do have treatments depending on what's going on, but we need to do better for patients and, for this disease. So, this is something where there is quite a bit of current research and trial development. So we'll talk about some current trial options going on at the University of Chicago. And that, we're also going to talk a little bit about clinical trials at large, how to find a trial, because the reality is, there's different trials in different regions of the United States. They're not always all over the place. Sometimes they're very restricted where they're actually happening. But it's actually an easy system to search for it. And then, again, I'll introduce myself for those I haven't talked to before or anything, but I'm Michael Macklin. I am a rheumatologist at the University of Chicago, and I help kind of lead our scleroderma program there. And I do just have a couple of disclosures, not really relevant to our discussion, but this, as an FYI, I am a speaker consultant for Amgen. It's for 2 medications that have nothing to do with scleroderma, but this is an FYI. All right, so really our objectives today, we're going to talk about navigating trials, and then we're going to talk about 3 trials that are currently happening at the University of Chicago that 2 of the 3 we're recruiting as of today, and 1 of them probably in the next month or so. And we'll kind of go through the rationale, what kind of patients we're looking for, et cetera. So as I already alluded to, so we really depend on clinical trials, not just for scleroderma, really in medicine at large. That's what moves things forward. There's a lot of stuff in the press about little small studies, animal studies that found X, Y, Z, but you really don't know if something actually works until you have a true, fairly large trial. Having an N of 2, so like having it happen in 2 patients, for example, or especially animal studies. They're more so hypothesis generating. They don't prove something works. And this is where clinical trials kind of come in. And there's lots of trials for all different diseases. Probably the most common trials for cancer, for example, because that's another disease state at large that needs better therapies for patients. But I would definitely classify scleroderma as one of these disease states. Again, do we have current therapies? Absolutely. Would I say they're great? No. We need better options, and this is how we go about trying to accomplish that and seeing what works, what doesn't. Of course, many trials the thing does not work, but that's kind of part of the process. And and it's important as well. So especially in rheumatology, we do a lot of things, quote unquote, off-label. So that basically means that therapy does not have FDA approval. So for example, in scleroderma, sometimes people use rituximab, that is off-label. Sometimes people use IVIG, that is off-label. There's only 2 medications that are on-label for scleroderma. That's tocilizumab, and it's only on-label for lung disease, and nintedanib. Everything else is technically off-label. Doesn't mean it doesn't work. But so physicians at large are still willing to prescribe things off-label, especially in rheumatology. It's very common. But ideally, it'd be good to have something that we're very confident that we know that works, has this FDA approval. And I think it makes us feel better, it makes patients feel better, and this is another reason to try to do trials as well. And in general for trials, so as I alluded to, there's all different kinds of research. But really the gold standard for trials is a randomized placebo-controlled trial. And there's different phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 3 is kind of the one that gets approval. It's a large one. Phase 2 is a much smaller one. And phase 1 is really just kind of sometimes even uncontrolled. Everyone gets it. It's more of like a safety trial in some ways. But that's kind of the gold standard. So you basically have some sort of intervention compared to placebo or, I wouldn't say it's nothing because placebos do have an effect, but it's versus placebo. And then you kind of prove what's the safety of this medication or intervention compared to placebo, what's the efficacy. And this is the gold standard. This is what the FDA looks for. And this is really the main way we figure out if something actually works for sure. As far as clinical trials at large, so They generally are sponsored by some sort of company. There are a handful that are, more so by NIH, so like direct government, or sometimes they're funded by kind of patient organizations, but most of them it's by some sort of pharmaceutical company. But due to this, there often is funding available for patients as far as helping minimize the burden getting them. So by that I mean there's usually the treatments are free of charge, they're paid for by the sponsor, and there's usually some sort of stipend available. It's variable, of course, from study to study, and they usually do reimburse travel. Again, a little bit variable, but that's kind of the expected and norm. And even within the same disease state, as will be obvious later, the trials are all very different. Some trials are trying to accomplish different things, especially something like scleroderma, where it's a very heterogeneous and very different disease from person to person. And even if they're trying to accomplish the same thing, there are widely different inclusion and exclusion criteria. So the inclusion criteria are the things that must be true for someone to enter a trial, and exclusion criteria are the things that must not be true or have to be false to also enter a trial. So they're pretty variable from trial to trial as well. And so as far as finding out about trials, there's definitely some word of mouth. So at meetings like this, sometimes the trials kind of permeate our colleagues, and so we're aware of it, but not always. Sometimes you may hear about it just online. And there is some targeted advertisements that some trials do that you may or may not get targeted for on Facebook, on Reddit, or wherever. But one of I think the best systems for searching for trials, if you are someone who's interested, is there's actually a really good search tool on clinicaltrials.gov. So all clinical trials have to be registered through a central system that this searches. And it actually doesn't just even include United States trials. Actually, it's international. Even I guess countries we are less friendly with, like it even has places like trials happening in the Russian Federation, for example. So if there's an active trial going on in really the world, it is listed on this database essentially. So this is just kind of a picture of what that would look like. And it's fairly easy to use, honestly, but you basically just will go on the site and you put in either the intervention you're looking for, is like your drug name, or in this case, you'd search like scleroderma or systemic sclerosis. There's an option to either do all studies, which is a little bit less helpful because that will also list things that are currently not recruiting, or there's an option to select either soon to be or currently recruiting. And you type in, for example, systemic sclerosis, you get a bunch that come up. You can filter by region, and it will basically display, what the kind of the basics of the trial, and importantly, there'll be some sort of contact person as well. So this is a good way to kind of see if there's anything else, because there are a couple of trials that are not occurring in the Chicago area, for example. Not even though Chicago's pretty big, we don't have all the trials between me and Carrie Richardson at Northwestern. We don't have every single trial in the United States in the Chicagoland area. So there's definitely some potential options elsewhere, or even again, there's this database will also search international options. So there may be things that come up, in France and Israel, wherever, for example. So it's a really a good tool to kind of see. If per your discussion with your rheumatologist, if things are not going ideally, or you'd be interested in, being part of trying to see if a new therapy works, this is a good tool to kind of search for that. So that's kind of clinical trial basics at large, and then the rest of the time we'll kind of go through what's currently going on at University of Chicago. I'll be pretty honest. 2 of the 3 trials are also available at Northwestern. We between us we have most of the trials in the Chicagoland area. One of the 3 I don't believe is currently planned there. I could be incorrect about that. But just to discuss kind of the rationale and, again, what kind of patients would be appropriate for these kind of trials. So the first one we'll talk about, and this is, I think, one of the options that patients and rheumatologists have been, really honestly excited about. It's a really different way of trying to treat this disease is one of the CAR T trials. Now, honestly, there's probably about 6, 7 of them going on right now with different companies throughout the country. They're all pretty similar, honestly, at least currently. We happen to partner with Cabaletta Bio Inc. And excitingly, I actually have one of my patients join the trial, and she should be getting the actual CAR T product sometime next month. But all of the current CAR Ts, including this one, are targeting CD19. It's on B cells, which there's a slide next that will explain that more. But basically, the idea here is kind of similar almost to rituximab, but there's some pros. So we think in most cases there is some sort of pathogenic antibody that occurs in scleroderma. Not everyone has a defined one. Some people, it's just a high-level ANA, but they don't have one of the defined ones. But we think that's what's going on in many patients. And so the idea would be we kind of get rid of B cells, which those are the cells that make antibodies, and get rid of the antibody, and then the hope would be that puts the disease into remission or at least stops it from progressing. That's the hope. Rituximab is a similar idea, so that's a CD20 targeted antibody. There's some theoretical benefits. CD19, and this will make more sense in the next slide, is on more cells than CD20 is. So you could hit some other B cell parts. So there's like a kind of a continuum of the B cell development. So it's a little more broad. And then the other theoretical benefit that is exciting for CAR T, rituximab's a big antibody. We know it does not do the best job of actually getting rid of the B cells in other diseases. So by that I mean it does a great job depleting B cells in the blood, B cells in the bone marrow, but it probably does not get into deep tissue. So it probably doesn't really get deep into the lungs, deep into the skin, while CAR T cells are a live cell. So there's a theoretical benefit that this probably does a much better total body B cell depletion compared to something like rituximab, for example. And this trial, because it's fairly early, so this is technically a phase 1, there is not a placebo arm. So everyone gets this, essentially. Now, there's different doses being tested, but everyone gets active drug, essentially. And so this is what I was kind of talking about. So there's different phases of B cell development that we can kind of see here. We're not going to go into detail. I mean, the key things are like the plasmablast plasma cells are kind of long-lasting, late-stage kind of B cell developing cells that have a lot of persistent antibodies. But you can kind of see, so there's CD20, there's CD19. CD20 is what rituximab targets, but CD19 is on more of these cells. So there's a theoretical improved targeting of kind of later antibody-producing cells. We'll also talk about this a little bit later. There's also something called BAFF, which is also known as BLIS, but it's necessary for B cell development. So there's one of our other trials is targeting that, which we'll talk more about. But there's different, not all B cell targeted options are the same. There's a little bit of different expression. And so the whole idea of the CAR T, so this is kind of taken from the cancer world. They basically take cells out of your body. They take T cells, which is the other main kind of memory arm of the immune system, the lymphocytes. But they take them out, they modify them, they change their receptor, so they target whatever you want to target. So in this case, CD19. They put them back into you, and then the idea is that the T cells basically attack your B cells and substantially deplete them. So that's kind of the rationale for this. And the current all of the current options do require some true chemotherapy, so cyclophosphamide, fludarabine. The idea for that is to kind of limit your body's ability to fight against the cells you're infusing. So that has definitely been a concern from patients with trials like this, because there's a cancer risk and a little bit is also fertility risk for younger patients as well who get true chemotherapy. I won't talk about it today, but we are also going to have a trial probably next year that has an option to do a chemotherapy-free arm of the study, but more or less the standard currently is to do that. But one of the reasons we're all fairly excited about this method of treating scleroderma is, so this has been done in small numbers of patients. And it seems to work well in those small numbers of patients. Again, though, like I alluded to, this is valid, but this is more of a hypothesis-generating research. This does not prove that this works. We need to see a much larger group of patients. This was a German group that tried this approach in 3 diseases: scleroderma, myositis, and lupus. And we basically saw pretty impressive responses. Again, this was only 4 patients, but the U-star score is basically like a kind of overall severity score that went down substantially. But even the Rodman skin score, and that's kind of our standard measurement of skin thickening, went down by about 12, which is actually quite good. So as a comparison, the studies for like mycophenolate, methotrexate for skin thickening, it's about 5-6, which is just above the minimum difference that's meaningful. So this was pretty significant as well. And the other, and I don't know if this is going to hold, but the exciting potential pro of this approach as well, these patients also stop their other therapies. So by that I mean, lots of patients in this small case series, they were on mycophenolate, toci, etc. They stopped them. So the only thing they were getting was this. So they got it one time and had this fairly sustained lower disease activity. That is only out for about a year, but that's one of the potential other advantages of this approach. It could be a kind of almost one and done approach where you get it, and people go into a low disease activity without other therapies on board. But again, we don't know that for sure yet. The other group that also published a case series on this was a Chinese group in the last year and a half. Similarly, they're looking at it in myositis and in scleroderma. I'll just talk loud because it's a little bit hard without me using the pointer. But it's kind of a similar result here. So CRIS is this kind of general composite measure. Improved the Rodman skin score. So this is only 2 patients. So again, these are really small case series. But someone entered at a 40 and went all the way down to like a 1918. Someone entered let's say a 23, almost went to like a 3 or a 4. That's more or less unheard of with methotrexate, mycophenolate. But really, had a lot. So these are just antibody titers SLC70. This is patient global assessment. This is physician global assessment. I will say the FVC mainly is stabilizing, which is probably what may be the best that can happen, because there's probably is a lot of scar and lung damage. And one of the unique things they did, they kind of looked at skin inflammation on an ultrasound. So this is baseline, month 1, month 3, month 6, and so on. And basically signal is like inflammation, essentially. So you can kind of see that the signal is kind of going away. But again, this is only 2 patients, but this is still quite exciting. So, the approximate schedule for this study, so assuming someone's a good candidate, the method of removing cells is termed leukapheresis. So that's is removing your T cells. Not all of them. They're just removing a population of them to later modify, essentially. So they modify them in a lab. They change the receptor that they have to target the CD19. It takes about 4 weeks, give or take. And then they're considered CAR Ts. And so what I alluded to with the chemotherapy, this does require a preconditioning with cyclophosphamide fludarabine for a couple of days. So that's, fludarabine is more so from the oncology world. Cyclophosphamide I use maybe 3-4 times a year for a variety of conditions. But these are higher risk drugs. So we know cyclophosphamide causes secondary cancers. It's not very high risk, but it's there. For younger patients, I've definitely counseled to try to do egg banking because cyclophosphamide is also a known cause of infertility. And like I alluded to, though, hopefully next year there'll be a different study that has an option to avoid that, but that's not currently available. But that is part of this trial. And that's, again, the rationale is to help kind of protect the CAR T cells because they are technically now foreign cells and your body could eliminate them. So that's kind of the rationale. This is an inpatient study at first. You come into the hospital, you get admitted to bone marrow transplant service. So you get the chemotherapy, then you get the cells, and we kind of keep an eye on you. There is a risk of CAR T with cytokine release syndrome, which is basically kind of like an immune overreaction. It's mostly been mild, so you kind of feel like you have the flu, basically. But it can be dangerous, so you kind of stay inpatient for monitoring, and there's different treatments for that happens. And then you kind of have to agree to be pretty close to the hospital for a couple of weeks in case something does go on. But again, because this is sponsored by a pharma company, so let's say you're coming out of state or coming from pretty far, that would be like something that's reimbursed, like if you have to stay in a hotel room or something. And so as far as inclusion for what kind of patients is this trial looking for, 18 to 75, that's fairly standard for most trials. Most trials don't want to enroll pediatrics, with some exceptions, and most trials don't want to enroll people of more advanced age because it's a little bit more risky. The disease duration is 7 years from first non-Raynaud node symptom. And that is kind of the rule of thumb for trials. I don't think there'll ever be any trials that are looking at people who've had disease 20 plus years, for example, because there's a lot of permanent damage, unfortunately, at that point. Though this number is variable depending on the study. So there's another study that's, again, because there's a couple different CAR T products. One will probably join that probably also won't be available to next year. Cuts it off at 15 years, depending on what's going on. But this one is 7. And then you had to have either had intolerance or kind of failure of at least 2 medications. They do include hydroxychloroquine, which is a low bar. I don't really view that, honestly, as a great scleroderma treatment, but it includes that. So there's a couple different cohorts they're looking at for this trial. There's a skin and an organ cohort, basically. So they're looking at people with bad skin, and they're looking at people with organ involvement. So for just skin, again, that Rodman skin score is really important. And honestly, a lot of people may not even know what their score is because a lot of community rheumatologists don't do this routinely. But you need to have a skin score of 15 to 35 or elevated inflammatory markers and kind of very early disease. Or if you have a very, very, very high skin score above 35, then you can have disease duration within 7 years. But this is a pretty significant skin score. It'd be very hard to reach this with limited disease. This is basically going to be a diffuse, for someone with diffuse disease. Outside of that skin involvement, though, we're definitely interested in having people with more so organ involvement, and this would be like be more inclusive of people with limited disease. So they do include history of scleroderma renal crisis, which is fairly uncommon. If you've had myocarditis, heart block, or heart failure thought to be due from scleroderma, that's another disease qualifier as well. That's actually one of the qualifiers my own patient had to get into the study. Or if you have kind of interstitial lung disease. And it's kind of a fine balance of significant lung disease, but not too significant. But basically, we see the cutoffs here. but this would be a pretty large proportion of people who have lung disease. Or you can also kind of meet criteria for progression, which is the one on number 2. That's kind of the definition of progressive pulmonary fibrosis. So there's a couple of major exclusions. Again, it's a fine balance of severe but not too severe, and that's basically because they're worried about safety in that population. But needing oxygen at rest is an exclusion. They are not generous, despite my protests, honestly, with the pulmonary hypertension cutoff. It's pretty low. So it's only 25, which is not hard to meet, unfortunately. Having very low heart function as a cutoff, having kidney disease that's significant, or having GAVE, that's something that can happen in scleroderma, where you have kind of like bleeding blood vessels in the stomach. Yeah, that's active. That's also an exclusion. And again, the intention of this, which is interesting, is to replace current therapies so that there's no concomitant therapy allowed. Once you get it, you come off everything, basically. And there's a pretty large washout for rituximab, because again, rituximab's kind of in the same thinking of this, so but there's a pretty large washout of 6 months. So that just to clarify, washouts basically you couldn't have received rituximab for 6 months at least. So that's that study. And again, you'll see these studies are pretty different. Another one that we are currently recruiting for is Conquest. So this is a unique study. It's actually sponsored not by pharma. There's pharma partners, but it's actually from the Scleroderma Research Foundation, which is much more of a patient-facing organization. But this is a unique study. It's a platform trial. So that's basically, so most studies test one thing. It's placebo versus drug, and maybe the drug has a couple different doses. The idea of this study is to really rapidly try to see what drugs are effective for this disease. There's currently only 2 medications, and they're actually from different companies, which again is not usually a thing. Most companies don't partner. But they're actually testing 2 different drugs at once. And the goal is to slowly increase it over time. I believe, I'm sure some people are familiar with Dr. Khanna out of Michigan. He's the person kind of leading this, but I believe the intention is to eventually raise this up to 5 different drugs at once. But so because of that unique design, the nice thing as well about this, there's a lower placebo chance. So normally you basically have a half chance of getting placebo. It's 50-50. But because there's 2 different drug arms, it's more of a 2/3 chance of getting active drug, only a 1/3 of getting placebo. And as part of the trial, so there's and the drugs being tested are different. You do have to be willing to receive either. You can't say, well, I only want to be put in the arm that has the pill, or vice versa. You have to be willing to have both. And this is designed as a lung disease trial. That's partially, that's honestly one of the more objective ways to measure success of drugs, but the hope and intention is that this is not just a lung drug, that this is hopefully going to help other parts of the disease. But that is the primary focus of the trial is lung. And again, I'm going to, because it's very small on my side. So one of the drug candidates is nerandomilast. This is a PDE4B inhibitor. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of a primolast. We use that for psoriatic arthritis. It's in that kind of family of medications, but there's hope that this subset would be more tolerable, because a primolast has tons of diarrhea. The hope would be being more selective doesn't. And the unique thing, this drug's thought to have kind of anti-fibrotic and anti-inflammatory properties, which is basically scleroderma. Scleroderma is a disease of fibrosis, inflammation. And the one thing missing, there's a vasculopathy component as well. So like blood vessel issues. That's the Raynaud's, the pulmonary hypertension part. I think they all kind of intersect. But this drug potentially can hit 2 of the 3 at least. It basically increases cyclic AMP, which is a messenger. And this picture just has some examples. We're not going to go through this in detail either, but this likely hits multiple different parts of lung inflammation. So that's basically what this is showing, that cyclic AMP signaling, it's responsible for a kind of inflammation in immune cells in the alveoli, the little air sacs in the lungs, and the skin layer of the lungs as well. There's some interaction with fibroblasts, that those are the cells that lay down scar. There's some other it's basically really involved in inflammation and fibrosis in the lung. So there's a decent mechanism that makes a lot of sense for this medication. And I'm honestly also pretty excited about this medication. We'll see. There's a disease called IPF, or idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. It is not thought to be autoimmune, and actually it really has very little therapy as well currently. But this drug seems to work for that. This is probably going to be the first, one of the first non-antifibrotics approved for that disease. And this comes up all the time. I don't treat IPF, but we are always trying to figure out sometimes with lung disease, does someone have IPF, does someone have a rheum-induced lung disease, because sometimes they don't look that different. So it seems to work in that disease. It's not FDA approved yet for that, but the top line results was it worked. So it doesn't mean it's going to work in this, but it raises probability a little bit, that if it works in one kind of fibrotic lung disease, it may work in others. So it makes it, at least to me, a little bit more exciting. The other drug being tested, and this is the sub-Q. So nerandomilast is a pill. This is the sub-Q injection one. This is amidalimab. This is an OX40 blocking drug. And basically, it's being looked in other diseases. It's being looked in eczema. But basically OX40, and again, not going to go through details here, but it's involved in a lot of T cell activation. So that's kind of the other arm of the immune system, is B cells, T cells. And so the thought is blocking this would be helpful, because too much OX40 kind of signaling causes a lot of inflammatory messengers and expansion of the T cells. So Tregs are kind of as the name would imply, they regulate the immune system. They're kind of the yang of the yin. So a lot of immune cells cause inflammation because they're trying to fight viruses, bacteria, etc. But Tregs kind of suppress stuff. But this signaling actually causes less of the suppressors to be available. And there's a lot of also, kind of antigen. So antigens are just like what we're responding to. So basically it drives different kinds of T cell expansion. And even though, like we mentioned for the CAR T, we think scleroderma is in large part a B cell disease, none of these pathways exist in isolation. So the reality is there's T cells involved as well. And that goes for a variety of diseases. The immune system, all of these kind of silos talk to each other. So there's not really anything that's only one kind of cell. So the inclusion summary, this is also about 7 years, which is, again, fairly standard for most trials. And the important thing is to specify Raynaud's can happen years before the disease actually declares itself. We're not counting from Raynaud's, we're counting from the first non-Raynaud's symptom. You have to have a skin score less than 40, which is most patients. Above 40 is extremely high. I've never seen someone above 40. You have to have ILD with at least some fibrosis. They do want to mostly include diffuse patients still, but they will include limited, and they will also include the more rare Sine scleroderma. So that's the systemic sclerosis without skin thickening. But they cap it at 30% of enrollment. And also, the only age cutoff here is above 18. So for inclusion, you have to have at least one of these things. So either pretty significant involvement in CAT scan, about 10%. You have to have elevated inflammatory markers, or FVC, so that's on the pulmonary function test, less than 80% within the past 3 years, or progression. And there's this is a defined kind of definition. I didn't put them all down here. And again, it's a balance. They want low FVC, but not super low. So it has to be above 45% predicted. And DLCO, that's the measure of how the gas diffuses across the blood vessels in the lungs. That has to be at least 30%. So the nice thing about this study, so there's really two ways I think to go into it. You can go right into this study. So I think this is an appropriate option for someone with new ILD. You don't have to fail anything to go into this study. So you can go right into it if you have new ILD. Or the option is you can stay on mycophenolate. So what we try to do in clinical trials when possible, if there's a clear standard of care, most trials will allow that in the background. That's the most ethical, honestly. So like, for example, for cancer, there's nothing that's doing versus placebo alone, because that's not ethical. It's not ethical to say we're not going to treat your cancer, because we have treatments. So it's usually standard of care plus placebo versus the new thing plus placebo. In the cancer world, for example. So this is one of those trials where you can be on back mycophenolate, because mycophenolate is kind of the default first-line option for ILD. The only thing is you have to have been on it for at least 4 months at a stable dose. But that's the other way you could, let's say, if you progress a little bit on mycophenolate, you can go into this trial as well. But you cannot be on tocilizumab, though. So that's kind of the summary exclusion. If you have pretty significant kidney disease, you'd be excluded. Known pulmonary hypertension, but above 30. So a little bit better than the 25 for CAR T, but above 30. And you cannot be an active smoker or vapor. So that's that trial in a nutshell.
When they say sub-Q, are you doing sub-Q yourself, or do you have to go in?
That's a good question. I am pretty sure you go in for it. Okay. It's this due to the trial. If the drug works, there'd be no reason for it. But yeah, I'm pretty sure it's observed. And I want to say it's a monthly thing, but I'm not. That could be that could be misremembering, but I'm pretty sure it's monthly. So that's that medication. As far as venous, so this is anagumab. This is a trial sponsored by Novartis. They're mainly looking at diffuse type disease. And again, same thing as with the one we just talked about. It's a skin trial, but the hope is it works for other things that aren't skin. So this is, again, that same picture. So this medication targets the BAFF. So that is on B cells. So there's some B cell depletion, but it's also necessary for B cell development. So you kind of get like a two-tiered, hopefully, response here. And this is just an example of how this BAFF or BLIS, they're the same thing, is involved in B cell development. So there's actually a medication that currently exists that does this called Benlysta, belimumab. There actually is a trial, I don't think it's recruiting anymore, for scleroderma. So we use it for lupus currently. But this drug's kind of, in a way, this plus rituximab, not quite, but it blocks this necessary developmental signal, but also gets rid of B cells. So that's kind of how this works. Again, inclusion 18 to 70. You have to have diffuse disease. This one's only 5 years, so a little bit lower disease duration. And they want people with a skin range of 15 to 45 for the Rodman. So, and there's some additional inclusion. So they kind of want people that are pretty progressing, unfortunately. So having more than a 3-point increase in the past 6 months in that skin score, having very early disease, 18 months or less, or having elevated inflammatory markers or this involvement of more than 2 body areas or 1, with the, so that's right here. They want people that are mainly SLC70 or RNA poly 3 positive, and ANA alone is fine. Cannot be a centromere pattern, but it's limited to 30% of patients. So they're mainly trying to include a traditional diffuse patient. And these are the exclusion criteria. You can't have had more than 10-point decrease in the past, having very significant lung disease, or they're a little bit more vague with their pulmonary hypertension cutoff. They just define it as having basically a requirement for IV therapy, which is pretty substantial, or there's different WHO classes for how much you can function. It's a very low functional, so basically people who have trouble walking due to shortness of breath. So they're a little more generous with the pulmonary hypertension cutoff for this trial. Background therapy for this is also allowed, but only with mycophenolate methotrexate, not tocilizumab. So, in summary, there's a lot of promising trials going on for systemic sclerosis throughout the country and definitely in our region. And I would definitely, so let's say none of these sound interesting, but people are interested in trials still. Again, clinicaltrials.gov is a really, really good search tool, because there's definitely trials that someone may be interested in that are not happening in this region. And that's really the best way to find out about it. I had updated my slide last night, but you can always reach out to Stephanie if you are interested. I'm happy for her to give you my email, and we can always chat, but always can reach out. And but thanks everyone for your attention. Happy to take questions. I hope this was helpful.